Hello, everybody, and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to discuss the symbolism of the seventh house, seventh Bhava. Bhava is a house in Sanskrit, and this is from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective. So let's get into it. If you're new to Vedic astrology or my videos, all of my teaching videos on the subject are on my concepts playlist. So wherever you see a double asterisk in one of my talks, that means I have a teaching video on that topic. For this particular talk, there aren't a whole lot of videos that I think you would need to see to get a lot out of it. It depends on where you're starting from and depends on how your mind puts things together. But these may be helpful. So the first one, North, South, and East Indian style charts. I do also cover Western charts in that video, but I don't have that listed in the title. And then introduction to navigating a birth chart, introduction to constellations or Rashis, constellation or Rashi categories. And then I do have a whole playlist on each of the classic planets of Jyotish, also known as grahas. And for this talk, the symbolism of Venus or Shukra is probably the most important one. And then if you want more content like this, I would look at my Houses Bhavas playlist. And if you don't know any of the houses, I would probably start with the Lagna, also known as the Ascendant Rising Sign or First House to get a good foundation. Okay, so the seventh house or Bhava, it's also known as the Kalatra Sthana. Kalatra means wife or consort. Um, so makes me wonder if only men got their charts read way back in the day. Yes. That could be very possible. I don't know. I don't know if that's actually true, but just from the name of this, I mean, why wasn't it like husband or something? So anyway, but the seventh house in the natural zodiac. So the natural zodiac is when you put the first constellation of Aries or Mesha in the first house. So if you look at the chart on the right here, that's what I have. I have that little one in the pop a square there. One designates the constellation, number constellation in the zodiac, so the first constellation, which is Aries or Mesha. And this is a North Indian style chart that I use in my talks. So the first house is that top diamond with the one in it. And again, the one is not there because it's the first house. The one designates that Aries will be in the first house in this chart. And then since it's North Indian style chart, you will count counterclockwise or backwards. So then you go to that upper with the upside down triangle in the upper left side. So that's the second house, but the two there is to designate the second constellation of the zodiac, which is Taurus or Vrishabha. Okay, so anyway, so you count kind of more clockwise with North Indian style charts. In any case, when you do put Mesha or Aries in the first house, the seventh house will be owned or governed by the constellation Libra or Tula in Sanskrit. And Libra is ruled or governed by Venus, the planet Venus, or Shukra in Sanskrit. So Libra as a sign, we call a movable air sign. So movable means a lot of activity, a lot of movement, and air means primarily one of ideas. Okay, as opposed to an earth sign, which is more about material world, as opposed to a water sign, which is more about emotions. Okay, so in Sanskrit, movable air sign is Charavayu. Okay, so the primary motivation of this house is enjoyment or pleasure. So it's a kama sthana. Kama means pleasure or enjoyment, and sthana means house. So that tells you quite a bit already. Also, the seventh house is a Kendra. So a Kendra is considered kind of a core energy of a person if we're reading this for a person. So all the Kendras are the four diamonds in the middle. So literally kind of the core of the chart. So this is a pretty important house, generally speaking, just to understand the general makeup of somebody beyond the specific symbolisms of the house. The other thing is the seventh house is a Maraka sthana. Maraka means death. So you can actually, when people do longevity studies for people, um, they one of the houses that they'll look at is the seventh house, and that may be, I'm guessing, because the seventh house is the eighth house, 12th. So the 12th house is loss and expenditures in general. and the eighth house of any chart is death. So yeah, so you can kind of see the relationship there. So symbolisms of this house. So health-wise, we would be talking about sexual organs, specifically internal sexual organs. So like uterus, ovaries, prostate, that sort of thing. Um, Also sexual relationships, marital relationships, which can affect, psychology quite a bit. Um, and other things sort of in this lower abdominal area. So things like the adrenal glands and hormones, kidneys, the low back in general, the lower abdomen and all the organs I mentioned, also the hips generally. Um, so you can see that like this area, and also if you think about like the first and second chakra, that's where the first and second chakras are. And the first chakra is all about, our energy center is all about your base in the world, like family and stuff like that. And then the second chakra is all about relationships with others, especially sexual relationships. So you can see all that energy being presented here. And, those two things, those two energies, and this area of the body is essentially the kind of what creates equilibrium in the body, right? So if your hips are out of balance, if you've broken your hip and you can't, walk straight, because of the pain or something, that'll throw your balance off because usually you compensate with the other side. Um, and so similarly with hormones and stuff like that, hormones, especially the HPA axis, right? The hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. These major equilibrium glands that produce hormones are all about creating equilibrium in your body, like your circadian rhythm, your ovulating rhythm if you're a woman, that sort of thing. Um, so things just, and also Libra is symbolized by the scales. Now, in Western symbolism, the scales denote more like scales of justice. But in Vedic astrology, the scales of Libra represent scales of uh, the marketplace. So a little bit more business oriented and stuff like that. But there's still this notion of equilibrium and balance. Okay, either way. Um, so other things like, is somebody living a proper balanced lifestyle? Are also enjoyment, right? Because this is a Kamastana. Are they enjoying their life? And if they're not balanced, are they prone to excesses, right? That's the opposite of balance. Longevity and death, I mentioned, and then also desires, because that's essentially a lot of what sexual relationships are about, marital relationships can be about, depending on the motivation there. Yeah, so you can see how this is all tied together physically and then mentally, emotionally. Now, people associated or linked, symbolized by the house, spouse, um, mostly the first spouse, though. We don't always assess other spouses, second, third spouse, if there are more than one here. But we would look here initially just to see if there was likelihood of more than one spouse or more than one partner or a lot of relationships or very few relationships, romantically or sexually, that sort of thing. So even if you're not legally married to be a spouse or have a spouse, then you would look for like a spouse-like partner. So something that was a little bit more established, maybe a little bit more depth, maybe a little bit more longevity. Somebody who is a little bit more of a significant partner as opposed to, for some people, random partners, right? Um, this can also be on the list as adopted child. I'm not exactly sure why. Um, I was wondering if maybe since it's the third house from the fifth house and the fifth house is children, it could be like, sibling of child, but I don't know exactly how they got it adopted, except for we'll talk about how this house is related to travel. So maybe if it's like a sibling of a child from far away, maybe that's how you would get an adopted child if you had like a international adoption or something like that. So I'm not exactly sure why that's on the list, but I added it to yours just so you're fully aware of what people talk about. I clearly don't use that, but other people do. So, and then also because the seventh house is the farthest house away from the first house, and the first house represents the self, this represents the other. The relationships in general, especially a spouse. And so, if there's anybody, like we've talked about some of the other houses, like the second house is family and inner circle, the third house, siblings and friends, or friends who are like siblings, that sort of thing. So, when you're in doubt and you have a non-blood related person that you're trying to assess, you can attempt to do that, the analysis from the seventh house. Okay, so because of partners, this is a big house for partners and sexual marital relationships. Um, you're also going to get, the sort of accoutrement related to relationships, so things like courtship, right? The activities leading up to marriage, adultery, and affairs. If this house is severely afflicted, that might be the case, also depending on what planets are involved and the conditions, involved and the houses that they represent as a possibility. This could also be bed, um, because that's where a lot of the activities with, that sort of define, spouse, well, typically, not always, right? Spouse or, significant other relationships, that's part of what goes on, but not always, right? Like maybe if you had, really strong Saturn or Mercury here, because those are planets that usually indicate like isolation rather than togetherness. Saturn through kind of physical separation and Mercury through mental separation. If those are really strong planets, especially if they're aspecting or involved with the seventh house, then somebody may not share a bed with their partner, or they may not partner at all because they're not interested in sharing a bed with anybody, generally speaking, or it's rare for them. So you can see how the different planets might give you information on the seventh house. Also, nighttime activities, because again, a lot of private relationships. Uh, that's literally and figuratively where the action happens. Although night activities, it could also be because the seventh house represents the west, where the sun is setting, and so during the day when people are busy at work, they may be. Not always, but they may be distant from their spouse. And then, after work, after daytime hours, that's when most of their time is spent with their significant other. But you can also look at nighttime activities in the fourth house because the fourth house represents like midnight and, the deep, dark night, after people have not only just met up with their partner, over dinner, and then relaxed a bit, and then maybe a little hanky panky or something, and then they're asleep, hopefully by midnight, most people, according to Ayurveda. Um, so maybe we should say evening activities instead of night activities. But I think you get the drift here. Also, home, you can assess home to some extent here. And that might be slightly different than house, because typically house is assessed from in fourth house, the fourth bhava. This is the fourth from the fourth, right? So that would be a bhavam, uh, which I have a whole video on that. So house of the house. So this is kind of more, I think, the relationship side, how this is home versus a house. House, I would look at the fourth house, and the seventh house, I would look at home, like how are the relationships inside the home. Although you might look at both potentially. Also independent business, so entrepreneurship of all kinds, and part of the reason here is that the seventh house is the 10th from the 10th house. And the other thing is, this house is ruled by Libra. Again, the scales of Libra in Vedic astrology are related to the marketplace. So this is more business ventures and that sort of thing. So it may not be a full, LLC, or, you're like a CEO, IPO type situation, but any kind of like, side hustle, side gig where you're not necessarily answering to a boss, like a, typical 9 to 5 job. Not necessarily government work. Government work is related to the ninth house if you're looking at career. And not necessarily, it may be related to artists and artisans, although artists and artisans are typically more like third house, especially artisans, and fifth house. Third and fifth can be artists and stuff like that. Um, but they might just do it for fun, rather than make some sort of livelihood off of it. Yeah. So, and then business partners. So all the things related to independent business can be assessed through the seventh house. And then travel. So why might this be? Well, the first house is not only the self, but the birthplace. So since the seventh house is the farthest from the first, it's places that are far away from home, the birthplace. So foreign places, journeys in general, roads, vehicles. Vehicles could be here not only for traveling but also because the fourth house is related to vehicles. That's primarily where I assess them. But anything that's going to support your journey. Also, again, if the seventh house is not, well conditioned and with benefic planets and things like that, it may be somebody who sort of like wanders aimlessly without clear direction and gets caught up in all sorts of mishaps while traveling. And it can also mean like just sort of like the journey through life. Like, are you following your true north, your North Star through life? Again, if the seventh house is afflicted, you might be very confused about which direction to take and which direction to go in and, wander off your more Dharma path if the seventh house is afflicted. So, also, some troubles can be associated with this house. And I think that's because, again, sort of like what I mentioned, why would the seventh house be a Marakasthana or a house of death or longevity? But also, again, if things are not going well here with malevolent planets that are very strong or, debilitated planets or what have you, um, then, affairs might happen and that sort of thing, which is essentially a form of moral conduct. At least, again, everybody's got different ideas about this, but, if we're talking about traditional Indian philosophy and the ideas of karma, if you pledge, your life to somebody else and you don't hold that up, in this system, that's a pretty big deal. Um, but again, then there are other sides where it's like, well, if marriage is abusive or something, is that really to anybody's benefit to enable the abuser and then to allow the victim to keep suffering, So anyway, just throwing that out there. I'm just saying, I'm just sort of semi trying to explain why some of these things might be on the list. I don't know how people came up with this originally. Just passing the information along. So, but litigation. So yeah, divorce. If the relationship doesn't go well, if there are affairs, other sorts of controversies. Also gambling. I mean, we're talking about well, marriage and traveling. There's a bit of gambling involved there. But I think this whole sort of line here with troubles that can mount. Again, I think this is a reflection of other houses. Like again, the seventh house is the 12th from the eighth house. Uh, and eighth house is, chronic disease and death and bankruptcy, things most people don't want to experience. Also, sexuality and things that are hidden. And then, so we have the 12th from the eighth. So losses and expenditures due to those things. And then, and also why sometimes relationships don't work out is because the money goes south and the relationship follows. And then we have the seventh house is also the eighth from the 12th. So it's sort of the flip version of that, where, it's, death and litigation, bankruptcy due to loss and expenditures. So when there's too much loss, it's going to affect all aspects of your life, including potentially the relationship if it's not strong enough. So, career, if you were going to look at the seventh house for career, I already mentioned independent business is a big one here. So this might be somebody who's like a full-on entrepreneur, like, they set up their LLC and they're running their own gig and, their own office and their own boss, and that's their main source of income and things like that. This could also be consultants, more independent consultants who they're sort of in between where they are their own boss, but they're sort of like a part-time, contract employee, that sort of thing, where they're not doing necessarily a 9 to 5 thing. Although, you might have somebody who flips back and forth between maybe they start as a consultant and then they get hired on more permanently, more of a full-time, long-term position. That would be more of a 10th house thing. This might also be something like profit sharing. Like I was looking at somebody's chart who's a lawyer, and I could see like it was a couple of years ago, I think, their seventh house was, really strong. And I was thinking, oh, does that mean they're gonna, because they were working for a law firm, and I was wondering, I wonder if they're gonna like make a, kind of a step to the right and start their own gig, hang out their own shingle. But what happened is they ended up making partner. So when they became partner, they stepped into the role of profit sharing within the company that they were working for. So you could also look at it, you could also assess the seventh house that way. Um, and then what other things? Commerce. So people who manufacture, buy, and sell goods. So maybe, whatever, you're like you're a crafty type person. You make crafts, or you did some sort of artwork or painting or something, and then you sell them yourself. Like maybe you have an online store or something like that. That could be assessed here. Um, Also or who else does that? What's another example? Oh, people who like it could even be like homeless people who like, the ones who go around and they collect all the bottles and cans and stuff, and then they get some, a few cents, some change out of it. That they could have some strength in their seventh house if that's one of their main sources of income. It's not a 9 to 5 gig, it's not, government support, it's not artisan, it's not artistic, but they're still in commerce on some level. Also, intermediaries can be here, so brokers and agents. So again, now we're getting into like literally a bridge between business and partnerships. So somebody who brokers, business relationships and gigs for their people. That could be a seventh house thing. And then partnerships in general. So personal or professional, or sometimes they're both. If you have this super duper seventh house, maybe your spouse is also your business partner, that sort of thing. All right, so there you go, seventh house. So as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate you stopping by, listening to one of my talks. Again, all of my teaching videos on the subject of Vedic astrology are my concepts playlist. They can all be found there. If you're interested in a personal birth chart reading, I do them on Zoom. And if you're interested, you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com for more info. We have eclipses coming up at the time of this recording. I don't typically do readings during eclipses because the energy is too chaotic. But, I would probably be looking at doing them after the eclipse period. And then I have another YouTube channel on natural medicine where I talk about other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga. And then I also talk about other paradigms of natural medicine like homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. The name of that channel is Nature Source Care. If that's interesting to you, that's out there also. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. And I hope you found this interesting, helpful, and useful as you navigate the energy cycles of your own life. All right, so you take care until the next one. Namaste.